Hello to everyone who's joined us. We're just giving it another minute and we'll start on time. We're about to start. Please do introduce yourselves in the chat. Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll make a start. In this panel, we'll be sharing research findings from two projects funded by the British Academy in Jordan and Zambia. We are thrilled to have partners join us from both countries to share findings. But let me start by introducing the hosts and moderators of today's session. If I can have the next slide, please. I am Dina Dajani, a senior researcher at the International Institute of Environment and Development. And I am joined today by my colleague Marcel Marden, a fellow researcher at IIED, who I will hand over to in just over a minute, and Maren Thompson, Senior Programme Manager at IIED, who you will hear from later on during the Q&A and is supporting the running of this session. The findings we will share today revolve around three main themes. If I can have the next slide, please. Drought, displacement, and inequitable urbanization. There is considerable research and policy focus on drought as a driver of displacement. You may have come across the WHO estimation that up to 70 million people may be at risk of displacement because of drought. But our research looks at the intersections of drought and displacement across the migratory journey, in cities and towns where the majority of displaced people end up settling. To understand what kind of responses are needed in those contexts, we argue that the challenge of urban inequality needs to be addressed alongside drought and displacement. We hope the research that we share today illustrates how these three dynamics are closely connected and that therefore better alignment is needed in response to addressing them. We have a packed agenda today. After my and Marcel's introductory remarks, we will have three brief presentations from Jordan and three presenters from Zambia before opening up for Q&A and hearing back your reflections. Please do add your questions to the chat and you will have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask them yourself later as well. We'd like to start with a poll that should be appearing on your screens now. If you can take a minute to tell us how many displaced people you think there are worldwide. Just to note that by displaced people, we mean internally displaced persons, as well as people who cross borders, such as refugees and asylum seekers. Okay, so a close one there, and half of you are correct. The correct answer is 125 million displaced people as of the end of 2024, as reported by UNHCR in its latest annual report. UNHCR estimates that up to 90 million of them are displaced into countries that are facing high to extreme climate risks. So this idea of understanding risks in places where they settle is really, really important. So now we come to our research questions on the intersections of displacement and drought and why we employ an urban lens to examine this relationship. Firstly, urban areas host the majority of refugees worldwide. In some countries like Jordan, that percentage can be as high as 80%, with only 20% of of refugees living in refugee camps. Yet, humanitarian policy and programming, as well as research and policy, remain disproportionately focused on camps. Second, the majority of refugees live in protracted situations, defined as displacement that lasts longer than 5 years, with many living in exile for decades. Yet, humanitarian responses remain emergency-driven and not aligned with changing needs. Third, the majority of displaced persons also settle in cities, and most displaced people, refugees, asylum seekers, and internally displaced persons end up in the most impoverished and marginalized neighborhoods in those cities. So what our research is interested in is exploring how displaced people experience climate risks like drought in those marginalized neighborhoods where they settle, and how this impacts on their water access and shapes their social, civic, and political relationships, including, for example, relationships with neighbors, engagements with utilities, and claiming the right to water. I will now hand over to my colleague Marcel to tell us more about those neighborhoods.
Thank you so much, Dina. So continuing from where Dina's left. So these neighborhoods where refugees settle can look very different from one context to another. For example, it can be an informal settlement in one context or a low-income neighborhood in another. But as we hope to demonstrate from juxtaposing these host neighborhoods from Jordan and Zambia today, those neighborhoods also have many characteristics in common. They sit fully or partially outside of their city's regulated zones and are therefore left out of city development plans. They are also densely populated and rapidly urbanizing. They are usually underserved by wash networks, and water access is unreliable for their residents. Drought, which is increasing in frequency of recurrence, in duration, and in severity due to climate change, is exacerbating these inequalities in water access in these neighborhoods. So it's in this context that we launched our research project with the funding from British Academy. Key question: do these challenges of drought, displacement, and urban inequality intersect and shape the lives of the residents? And therefore, how can the challenges of drought, displacement, and urban inequality be responded to in a more integrated and aligned way? So to help us answer this question, next slide, please. We have experts from the UK, from Jordan and Zambia, and we will begin with findings from Jordan. So I'm happy to introduce Dr. Lucy Earle, Director of Human Settlements Group at IIED, who will give us a brief presentation on rethinking humanitarian aid as investment in wash services for refugees. Lucy, over to you.
Thank you, Marcel, and thank you, Dina. And great to be joined by so many of you online. Thank you for coming to hear us talk about these two very different contexts and hear about how we're joining themes emerging from them together. So I'm going to talk to you about a project that finished last year. It's called the Urban Refugee Dividend, Rethinking Humanitarian Aid as Urban Wash Investment, funded by the British Academy. And this was a multidisciplinary endeavour between wash specialists, wash engineers, social scientists in Jordan and the UK. So just to set the scene about Jordan, it's one of the highest per capita refugee hosting countries in the world. Over the last few hundred years, it's been a sort of temporary home to different refugee populations, but most recently that of Syrian refugees since 2012. The numbers are perhaps disputed about how many refugees there are, because there's a difference between being a registered refugee, registered with the UN, or the government, and refugees who, for one reason or another, choose not to register or whose registration lapses. But it's more than 1 million is sort of general term, but the number is decreasing slightly, as I'll come to, with the changes in Syria. Jordan is also, as many of you are probably aware, one of the world's most water-scarce countries. So IIED's research on displaced people in Jordan and elsewhere really focuses on refugees in urban areas. And we conclude those whose status might be irregular, who may not necessarily have the right to be in urban areas and who are not registered as refugees, but who believe themselves to be refugees. And that's where we start from. And our work has, over the past 5, 6 years, in a number of different contexts, has come up with this idea of urban first, which I'm going to explain very briefly. And we have an article published about this that we'll be able to share a link to later. But the idea here is that we believe that refugees have the right to live in cities. They do, according to international humanitarian law, at any rate. And we should be promoting their economic inclusion and supporting their agency. And critically, that it's local government that really should be at the centre of responding to refugee movements and those of IDPs into urban areas. We should be thinking about how to bolster services when they're under strain, including, of course, WASH. And we advocate taking a spatial lens, so looking at a geographic area that's impacted by displacement and looking at what needs to happen across different sectors and populations within that geographic area. Now, that might sound obvious, but it's not actually the way that humanitarians tend to operate. Most refugee agencies and others with a mandate to work with displaced people focus on the individual, the household, and their status as displaced, rather than thinking about the place that they're in. So that's where we're a little bit different. What we found and what sort of spurred some of this research is that there is a sort of continued overwhelming focus on the camp rather than the urban area. And this despite the fact that, as Dina's already explained, the majority of the world's displaced people are in urban areas and not living in refugee camps. And Jordan is a case par excellence of this. So on your screens, you can see Zatari camp. It's one of two main camps in Jordan for Syrian refugees. I'm not talking about Palestinian refugees today in this presentation. Zatari was at its population had fluctuated at the start of the Syrian refugee crisis, but for many years was stable at about 80,000 people. And that's the number we've based our research on, but it has recently decreased somewhat to around 59,000. And then Mafraq city on the right is near to Zatari. It's a typical sort of refugee hosting city with refugees in the city as well as on the periphery. And Mafraq city, it's hard to know exactly, but it's refugee population. But the overall population of the municipality doubled to 73,500 between 2011 and 2016. So we decided to focus on Jordan, partly also because people often say, well, in Jordan, you've got 80% of the refugees in towns and cities like Mafraq, and 20% or less living in the camps. And yet, 80% of humanitarian assistance goes to the camps. Now, camps are meant to be temporary, and yet they often stay in place for decades. So they don't provide a very good quality of life. There's been lots of arguments over the years, moral arguments about why we shouldn't be hosting refugees in camps. But those arguments have been made and not been won. But our question here was, can we make the money argument? Sorry, Mara, could you just go back just for a moment? Sorry. So just can we make the money argument and ask, if we're going to invest the same amount of money in WASH in a city than we have done at camp, what might we be able to achieve? So this was our this research project. The main question is the research project. Trying to do this kind of comparison. So we want to look at, sorry, you can go on to the next slide now. Sorry, Marin. I wanted to look at what has been spent over the past 10 or so years in Zatari camp, and then work with engineers to model what could be built in terms of sustainable water and sanitation provision in Mafraq city had that money be invested there instead. So we went out. We knew it was going to be hard to find data on this, on what's been spent in the camps. A big response over a decade, more than a decade. But we thought it might be possible at the start, and we went through huge quantities of publicly available data online. We looked at the IATI portal, which is the transparency portal where UN agencies are supposed to upload what they spent their money on. And we made direct approaches to UNICEF, who have been in charge of the WASH response across Jordan for Syrian refugees since 2012. We looked at a series of evaluations commissioned by UNICEF, but what we found just generally is that humanitarian assistance is not, where it's spent is not disaggregated, so that you can't find geographically sort of pinned data. You can't know from publicly available information what has been spent where in Jordan, whether it's basically camp or urban or in one specific camp. So we got to the point where we thought, well, what can we do? How are we going to do our modelling in Mafraq City if we don't have our number of the expenditure in the camp? But there was one data point that we were able to find, found two data sources for it, which was the cost of the network, putting in place the WASH network within Zatari camp. So at the start of the response, and for several years, there were temporary WASH solutions in place. So water was being trucked from external boreholes and wastewater was being trucked out, really quite significant distances, very expensive. And then slowly boreholes were dug inside the camp. And then between 2015 and 2019, in a phased approach, a network was put in so that all structures in the camp had a water tanker and attached to the network system. And then wastewater was pumped out and taken to a wastewater treatment plant just outside the camp. So we do have data points for this WASH network. So it's for 80,000 people. And I have a poll now coming up. So if we could have the poll. It's also on the next slide. Sorry, Maren. So here. So this question for you, participants. How much do you think it costs to put in place a WASH network in Zatari camp for 80,000 people? And I should say Zatari is in a semi-desert location, and it's about 12 kilometers away from the nearest city. Are we getting there? Okay. So the answer is 55 million US dollars. So just 4 of you got that one right. So that's a lot of money, I would say. And oh, sorry, I'm just trying to change my screen. Sorry, making a mistake there. Oh, I now can't see my screen. Sorry. There we go. So coming on to the next slide, please, Maren. Great. So then what we did is we worked with some fantastic engineers at the Jordan University of Science to model what we could buy with that money in Al Dakhia, which is, you'll hear more about it. It's a neighborhood in Mafraq City. And we found that for half the cost, we could put in place a network for more than 3 times as many people and over a 30-year lifespan rather than the 10-year assumed lifespan of the network in Zatari. And obviously, this is a real missed opportunity to look at a cost effectiveness of where you should be hosting refugees. If we really think if we had the data to hand, we could do a really good examination across different sectors of what it costs to host refugees in a camp versus an urban area, and thinking about sort of, in fact, the investment in Zatari, how this is, people are leaving Zatari now. So we've had 20,000 people have left Zatari in the past year. And this investment, $55 million, which is just a fraction of the overall expenditure in Zatari. We don't know how much was spent specifically in that camp over the period we were studying, the 10 years we were studying, but $500 million was spent by UNICEF on WASH in Jordan for refugees during that period. We found there's been very little engagement between humanitarians and city authorities to really maximize potential investments in urban areas, not just for Syrians, but obviously for Jordanians and other people living alongside. And really a disconnect between planning in terms of humanitarian planning and urban planning, urban and regional planning. One of the reasons why Zatari camp was so expensive as well, running into hundreds of millions of dollars for the WASH response beyond just the network, is because it was sited over an aquifer. And also thinking about the potential long-term impact of hosting tens of thousands of people in a desert in a water-scarce country. So on to the final slide, just to say that if you are interested in knowing more about this research, we've got a range of publications, some of them hot off the press. We have a 4-page policy briefing, got a longer working paper that goes into detail about the work that we did, some fantastic social research that Dina did with refugees in Mafraq. We have a very, very short article on forced migration review, and a longer one coming out very soon in the Journal of Humanitarian Affairs. And then if you're interested in this urban first approach, you can look us up in an article in Environment and Urbanization, which is open access. So thank you. And if any of that wasn't clear, if I was going too quickly, which I know I do, please shoot me questions later on. Thank you, Marcel.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy. And yes, to our participants, any questions you might have at this stage, please do feel free to put them in the chat, and we will come to that in our Q&A session at the end of today. So just to say thank you, Lucy, for that analysis. That's clearly drawing a stark contrast between where refugees are, which is in cities, and where humanitarian WASH funding actually goes, which is to camps. So if we take your proposal of an urban first approach to humanitarian aid seriously, then we must gain better understanding of where refugees are settling and what kinds of exposure to risks like drought they're actually facing there. So to help us understand that, I would like to invite Aya Hamad from UN Habitat in Jordan now, who will outline the multiple overlapping risks and challenges that converge hosting neighborhoods in Jordan. Thank you. Over to you, Aya.
Thank you, Marcel, and good morning and afternoon for everyone, and welcome to our session. Next, please. Welcome and joining us today. Our journey today basically takes us to Dahiyat al-Malik Abdullah and Mafraq, where we will be exploring how two powerful forces, drought and displacement, are reshaping access to water. Next, please. So our methodology of the study is basically a three-step approach. The first step is doing geospatial infrastructure mapping and neighborhood profiling. The second step is doing a representative survey of the neighborhood. And the third step is including semi-structured interviews with residents. This section of the presentation will be basically highlighting the first step of our methodology. Next, please. So just to give you a quick glimpse on the Dahiyat al-Malik Abdullah neighborhood, our study area, it is within the Mafraq city or the Greater Mafraq municipality in the northern side of Jordan, very close to Syria. The total area of Greater Mafraq municipality reaches 115 kilometers square. The neighborhood is 12.84 kilometers square, which is 11% of the city. The population of Al-Dahiyah in 2015, based on our latest population census, is around 15,000 inhabitants, which is 13% of the Greater Mafraq municipality's population. The study area or Dahiyat al-Malik Abdullah neighborhood has been identified as one of the most vulnerable neighborhoods in Mafraq city in terms of refugee influx on infrastructure networks. And for more information, you can check out the Mafraq spatial profile by scanning the QR code or just searching Mafraq spatial profile on the internet. Next, please. So the population was, as I said, in 2015, 15,745 inhabitants, of which there was 5,750 refugees. And today we're talking about 42,000 inhabitants. So it's over the past decade, the neighborhood's population has increased 40%. And this intensified the demand on housing, services, and water access. The map on the left, for example, is showing up. Can you go one slide, please, back? Yeah. So the map on the left is highlighting the population concentration or the population density. The darker color shows where the most population is settled, which is in the northern part of the neighborhood. Next, please. This neighborhood was specifically also selected in addition to being the most vulnerable neighborhood in terms of infrastructure, refugee influx on infrastructure networks. It also has a nice characteristic, which is part of it is a regulated area and the other part is unregulated area, highlighting that recommendations that come up from the study will include the two options or two scenarios that we have. So basically the regulated area in the neighborhood covers 35% of the total neighborhood area, compromising basically most of the percentage of the regulated area is residential, while the unregulated area is 65% of the total neighborhood comprising of rural land uses. And here I should highlight like one of the challenges contributing to inefficient access to the water network is that the regulated boundaries are not updated on a regular basis. And this results in having licensed buildings being located in areas considered unregulated. And this prevents the water company from extending the water network to reach out to these new houses and leading to unequal access to water networks. Next, please. So this slide here is showing the accessibility or the water demand on the water networks. So 71.5% of the built-up area within the neighborhood has access to the water network, which means 87.2% of the neighborhood's population has access to the water network. But these reflect the quantitative access, while the qualitative reality is different because residents do struggle with irregular supply and limited quantities of water being reached out to their homes. So the map on the left is showing that the darker blue shows the high demand on the water network, and this is because the water network is designed to serve a lower population than is currently using the network. Next, please. In regards to drought, so we have looked at the historical drought events that has been happening for the city in years 1981 until 2017. So we're talking about 5 to 5.2 events of drought occurring. And this impact both residential land and agricultural lands. So when we looked also at the future predictions and both scenarios, taking into consideration the moderate climate projection, we're expecting to have in 2050, 15 events, while in 2070, 18 events, and in 2125 events. That's in the moderate climate change projection. While if we're talking about a high emissions scenario, which is RCP 8.5, we're talking about 18 events in 2050, 21 events in 2070, and 26 events in 2100. And these are alarming numbers that raise a red flag to consider immediate mitigation and adaptation measures. Next, please. So we also looked at the impact that has been happening in the green cover as well at the neighborhood level. So there was, in the past 10 years, the neighborhood lost 2/3 of its green spaces. So starting into 2014, there was 534,000 meters square of green coverage, while in today we have only 176,000 meters square. And this shows also another alarming information that urban responses should take into consideration. Next, please. So talking about, and as Lucy has been explaining, and Dina, about Jordan being a water scarce country, the neighborhood sits on one major groundwater, which is Amman Zarqa groundwater. And the abstraction from this water basin has been significantly exceeding the safe yield, which is 87.5 million cubic meters. It is today the abstraction reaches 162.4 million cubic meters. This means that the balance shows a critical deficit of minus 774.9 million cubic meters. And this is also a red flag that we should be considering in our recommendations throughout the study. Next, please. Accordingly, so urban responses should include actions that genuinely integrate humanitarian wash into city development and drought mitigation planning. Thank you, and over to you, Dean.
Great, thank you so much, Aya, for that overview of the multiple risks that are converging in a single refugee hosting neighborhood. So I'll now invite my colleague Dina to share some voices of some of the residents at the Daya neighborhood so we can better understand ways to wash access. They intersect with displacement status. Over to you, Dina.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to contribute to the picture of the neighborhood that our partner Aya outlined by highlighting the voices of refugee residents. The analysis I will share is based on 27 semi-structured qualitative interviews I conducted with the Dahiya residents about their water access. And based on those interviews, our analysis suggests that there are 3 different layers of barriers preventing universal and equitable water access in contexts like Dahiya. The first, hard infrastructure, is the pipes, the networks that connect some households and leave others without a connection. The second, soft infrastructure, it relates to how water pumps, tanks, and water meters also mediate access for displaced people. This is particularly relevant in a context like Jordan, where water is rationed, so even households connected to the water network only receive it once a week, which means that those soft infrastructure play a role in how some households get more water than others. And finally, there are socio-political infrastructures, such as the water company, utility company, procedures for claiming the right to water, relationships with host communities, as water use becomes more politicized, as it becomes more and more scarce. So I'd like to take a moment to draw on some of residents' voices to highlight each of those barriers in turn. First, hard infrastructure. So here, one displaced Syrian household member living in Al-Dahiya told me, if you want housing that is connected to water and electricity, the rent is high. The difference is over 75 dinars, which is equivalent to 106 USD per month. We are not connected to the water mains, and it takes so much out of you just to get a private water vendor to come. You are under their control, their mercy. So what this suggests is that people tend to live in areas that are disconnected from water services because the rent is cheaper. And this shows how even within marginalized communities, wash services are further entrenching urban inequalities around displacement, leaving displaced communities more dependent on water vendors and more water insecure. Second, soft infrastructure. So based on what residents shared, a more complex picture of access emerged where connections to a water network did not necessarily result in equitable access. So here, for example, a displaced Syrian household member told me, neighbors won't give you a chance to fill up your tank. The people around us all have pumps and they are all extracting water. They don't leave us a turn. We only get water once everyone in the neighborhood finishes filling up, whatever is left. Some weeks we get water, others we don't manage it before the water supply is cut off. And this is because water is supplied once a week for a limited number of hours. So when you actually have infrastructures like pumps, what this does is it maximizes the amount of water some households get, but reduces the amount restricts the amount of water available to others. And the way that intersects with displacement is also compounding inequalities. Third and finally, socio-political infrastructures. And this quotation is from a refugee household that is connected to the water network in response to a question I asked on whether they have ever called to complain when they haven't received water on the day that the water supply is meant to be available. And she said, no, I haven't called the water utility company, nor has my husband, nor anyone in this building. The building was occupied by Syrian tenants. If the water arrives, great. If it doesn't, she laughed. We are scared of such things. I don't know. Our neighbor there, he is Jordanian. I heard he went to see them, the utility company, to complain about the water. This is just one quotation among many, but what it highlights is how drought is implicated in the politicization of water, further impacting on displaced residents' capacity to claim it. This is both cultural as well as procedural. So there is a question of empowerment around claiming the right to water, but also procedural inhibitions. Refugees are not allowed to apply for water connections under their own name, for example. This was a very brief introduction into our analysis from Jordan, but I hope it illustrates an overall picture, can I have the next slide please, of how water access is impacted by both urban inequalities and compounded by social and political vulnerabilities. This suggests the need to engage water utilities seriously in humanitarian responses, and that these responses must combine the technical, that is provision of wash, with the socio-political, such as empowerment around water rights to ensure water access equity. Thank you so much for listening. Marcel, back to you.
Great, thank you so much. Big thank you to our team from Jordan, and for you, Dina. On that note on inclusivity, we're now going to move over from Jordan to Zambia to learn about a totally different context. And then after that, we'll explore some of the similarities together. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. From Zambia, we have Melanie Tiro from People's Process on Housing and Poverty in Zambia, a local affiliate of Slum Dwellers International, an alliance of informal settlement residents across Asia and Africa, who are also working in close alignment within Zambia, grassroots movement Zambia Homeless Poor People's Federation, today represented by Christabel Chimba. And finally, we will also hear from Dr. Gilbert Siame from University of Zambia. So over to you. Melanie, I think you're the first speaker. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon and good evening, wherever you're joining in from. Happy to be here and thank you for joining. I think we can move on to the next slide. So today I'll be sharing about our experience in Maziopa, the research that we conducted. And just to give a background, in 2024, Zambia experienced one of the most devastating droughts. It was declared a national emergency by the president and saw a situation where there was loss in food, energy loss, water scarcity, as well as livelihoods. And this affected mostly poor and vulnerable communities. And one such community was Maziopa community, a rapidly growing informal settlement with an estimated population of 5,000 people residing on 24.816 hectares. It is home to internally displaced and migrant communities. However, its informal status means it falls outside the city's planning framework, meaning that they do not get the services they would necessarily get if they were recognized. Next slide, please. Okay, so we conducted a research together with the University of Zambia on the subject of displacement and drought. And the research sought to understand the intersecting experiences of drought and displacement. And there were political sensitivities and limited straightforward data collection on displacement. This is in line with some of the residents of Maziopa, in particular those with refugee status, didn't want to come out and be seen because of the implications. Those that didn't have their papers in order didn't want to speak out or be seen. But we tried to build trust as much as possible with all the residents and included some of the residents in the research themselves, and they were part, including the migrants, they were part of the research and the survey. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we conducted the research, we had several engagements to discuss the design and how we would go about doing the research. So looking at the data tools and also testing the tools. We did that together with the university and the federation, the community-based researchers. So we mobilized community members, and from there we were able to build community-based researchers from both Maziopa community and other settlements. So they participated in the data collection process. The locals were able to provide direction, and then also from the outsiders, just to minimize on the bias. We also did training, which included how to administer the questionnaire. They used the Kobo Collect tool. We also looked at issues of cultural and ethical sensitivity, safeguarding, and also the use of GPSs. We also engaged community members in advocacy, so they're able now to talk to their local leaders and engage with the local authorities. And so now I will just hand over to Christabel, and then she will share with you her experience in terms of the research methodology and its benefits.
Hello, everyone. I'll start with the research methodology benefits. The data collection process has given collectors a sense of pride to learning new skills. So it was a very nice experience when we learned about how to collect data in different ways. For example, we learned on how to use a questionnaire, on how to talk to people to collect data. Also, we also learned the data collection tool, which is called Kobo Collect tool, in which we're able to collect data, collecting pictures, also using the GPS to collect data, which was very easy for us to collect data. Ownership to be able to contribute to their community. So the members felt that the ownership, because of the approach that we had on them as we were collecting data, they felt that ownership. So confidence to engage the local authorities and duty bearers to demand their rights and offer recommendations. So on this one, the community now are able to speak to the authorities. They are able to engage the authorities, such as the councillors, the member of parliaments, on how they can access, for example, water connections, street solar lights, also on how to access the community development funds. So at least they are able to, have that confidence. They're able to engage their community leaders. The research has also given the community an opportunity to build the case for the regulation of for legalization of majopa. So now the community feel their community has to be legalized. They need infrastructure. They need things like schools, schools, clinics, and also the water points everywhere so that they don't have issues or they don't face challenges or they don't feel the continued impact on water so much.
So we'll now hand over to Gilbert.
Yes.
Perfect. Melan and Christabel and Dina and everybody, thank you very much for presenting this far. I'll present on the findings from Maziopa. And just to lay a little bit of background, Lusaka city and east region has a population of 3.3 million. And in the inner part is about 2.8 thereabout. Of that population, 72% live in informal settlements. And the migrants and refugees in particular are mostly in informal settlements. And Zambia is one of the biggest refugee hosting country in Africa. With regards to displacement and within the city and within the settlement that we are discussing, Maziopa, a lot of people are internally displaced people who have come from different parts of Lusaka and the country to settle in this community for various factors, as we're going to discuss. So we did a survey of over 500 respondents in the community, driven and orchestrated by the Federation and PPHPZ. And of that, it was established that 40% had settled in the community within the last 5 years. This speaks to the rapid urbanization of the city, just to indicate that the entire city is growing at 5% per year. So it's very, very rapid. Often formal city planning, formal water delivery instruments and mechanisms are often behind, and people have to find a way to survive. So very rapid urbanization with a very rapid movement of people intersecting, really speaking to the factors that Dina talked about, the social technical processes, the hard infrastructures and soft infrastructures intersecting that space. Second, we established through the survey that 60% of those we surveyed knew someone who had relocated due to a drought situation. This speaks to one, the drought that we just experienced, which was catastrophic in nature, one in living memory, and also speaks to the alternating nature of our climate, particularly in the Zambian context. One year you have a drought, the other year you have floods. So in terms of drought, 60% are directly impacted, and it makes them make the movement. This also speaks to the 40% who had settled in the community, partially moving from different areas. Then 70% of the population that was surveyed again indicate that they depend on shallow wells, which often dry up in the summer, and our summer here are hot seasons, and we're talking of August to about December, very hot, 30 plus degrees Celsius and dry. So during that time, even official 70-meter boreholes can dry, especially in a drought year. Even the municipal water facility or company faces boreholes drying. So the shallow wells in this particular community, they literally lack water. And then the majority of the people depend on these shallow wells as the community is outside the formal planning areas is in an informal settlement. So municipal services, including water, is very scanty to see. It's nearly not there. So you can imagine 70% of the water points that are locally provided by the local people and local actors, including civil society, dry. Where is the source of water? Big problem. Then 80% experience at least one day without usable water in the past year. So you can imagine one full day without water, what happens? So in this community, if you are in a place like Cape Town, would say day zero happens every other day. Day zero is a normal occurrence where people really have no access to water, especially safe cleaning water. And if I talk of safe, it's really looking at the unconventional sources getting from a borehole. Now a borehole dry and people can't have access to that water. Very big problem. And these are people who have moved from areas which have experienced drought, which have experienced groundwater depletion, groundwater damage. And in the end, wherever they are moving, is an unfolding crisis that continues to follow them wherever they are. Next slide, please. So really, what you get is that the 70% that experience borehole drying finding, and the 80% plus that of the respondents and households that experience no access to water, a catastrophic situation and condition, what becomes the possible survival strategy is aid, water delivered through aid and some form of social protection, social support. And this is not universally accessible. Not everyone who lacks water in that community actually has to this life-saving support mechanism in form of aid. And what I mean here is that we have a few international water delivered infrastructures in the community. Like JICA has been one of the key providers of aid water. But access is not uniform. Specifically, one, we're looking at migrants who often sometimes in this particular community were very shy to come out and indicate their status. And so if they live in hiding somehow to the officials, but in the local community, they are okay. But if they live in hiding somehow, then access to water becomes a little bit of a challenge. Second, we're looking at women who reported significant challenges related to gender-based violence because of lack of access to water. So if we look at this issue through an intersectionality lens, women with disability, women with migrant status or displacement status, women with children, and then borehole drying, and then aid a little bit limited, then the impact becomes even magnified. Then second, we're looking at households that are often unaware of aid programs that sort of try to provide water, but also lack of information, lack of effective communication to indicate who is eligible to what becomes a bit of a challenge in terms of who is eligible to get what type of aid to access water. Then weak governance feedback loops, residents feel disempowered decision making. It's an informal settlement. There are state structures like ward development committees, but to what extent can they influence and broker between state systems and local innovations? That remains a challenge, especially a community of moving people that have come running away from drought, running away from lack of water, but then at the same time, the same area they have come to, drought continues to unfold, and then they look forward maybe to the next move. So how do we even invest? We need to think critically about that. How do we engage with such groups where rapid migration, rapid urbanization, and breakdown in infrastructure delivery mechanisms and water delivery mechanisms intersect every day, and creating really a dynamic unfolding situation. And we add a climate layer there on top, it becomes very complex. So focus on groups with displaced and refugee residents. In this case, there is need to really look at how aid can reach migrants of the type I described, especially if we look at it from the intersectionality lens, people with multiple identities. Being migrant is one of them. Disability is another. And a woman without much education is another. So really intersecting factors. And then you add a layer of hard infrastructures. So the intersections are very, very deep. Next, please. And as I conclude, I want to I'll speak on the conclusion, but I want to hand over to Christabel to quickly speak about the gender impacts of these findings.
Well, on the gender impacts, increased unpaid labor in water collection. So during the drought season, people were collecting water. Were collecting water out of necessity. Reduced income opportunities due to time burdens. So during this time, people were spending most of the times collecting water. They spend most of the times busy collecting water instead of maybe focusing on things that will improve their income, such as doing gardenings or engaging themselves into different kinds of business like barber shops, restaurants, or anything. So greater exposure to gender-based violence and domestic conflicts. In this case, most women and girls wake up early in the morning to go and fetch water. So if they go, like they take a long time to go out to fetch water, when they come back, for women, their husbands will bring up domestic conflicts, such as thinking their wives are cheating on them, or their wives are being lazy or anything. And for girls, sometimes they face challenges like they are being abused verbally or provoked by street boys who are just there doing nothing. So because people lost jobs during the time of the droughts, there was mental health challenges. Most of the people were laid out of they were laid off their jobs. They lost their jobs, they lost their businesses, and they lost opportunities that they were doing, such as for women, they were doing restaurants, baking, because in Zambia we use hydroelectricity power, whereby we depend on electricity. So on such times, the hours that power was given was reduced maybe to 5 hours to 6 hours, whereby they could not do anything. So this made people who lost their jobs result into issues like depression. Others had hypertension. Others engaged themselves in drug abuse, like drinking, smoking, and getting sick. Then the next is on menstrual hygiene. Of course, women and girls need a lot of water to manage their menstrual hygiene. So they had issues, they had challenges. For example, some girls even used to abscond from school because there was not enough water to clean themselves. Same with women. And sometimes they were not like moving around, fear of the things that can come up. Next is Madam Melanie.
Yeah, so thanks. When we talk of conclusions now, what are the insights that we're picking? The core is first to look at our findings also together with what has come from Jordan. The three drivers, the soft infrastructures, the hard infrastructures, and the technical, social-political factors intersect very, very deeply. And we find this clearly illustrated in our case. So we need to look deeper into those drivers and see how can we begin to unlock and invest to mitigate the impacts. The second, in terms of conclusion, is that water insecurity, displacement, and inequality are very deeply interconnected. So one might think Jordan and Lusaka to be very far, but this is exactly what is coming out, very similar. And the conditions are different, but the experiences look quite similar in terms of the drivers. Then Maziopa demonstrates the urgent need for us to think in an integrated way when we address migration challenges, but also when we look at the urban development processes and responses. If we think of communities and think of infrastructures at the community level, we might be able to arrest some of the problems that come with the rapid migration and rapid displacement as well as migration. We might be able to act in the intersection, in the in-betweens to address the crisis, and that's very important. Then it is important also to look at these findings through a locally led inclusive planning approach in order to build resilient and equitable settlements that eventually contribute to equitable and livable communities. So the idea of locally led, community-driven, with support from city systems, city governments, becomes very important. But learning from the community is very crucial. Next, please. In terms of recommendation and lessons, what we learn by engaging and working in this project in Lusaka and by cross-learning with our colleagues in Jordan, we see that we need to improve wash access for us to address secondary displacements. 5% people moving, 40% of them moving within 5 years. And if we do next year, we might actually find a bigger number. So we really need to look at what are the drivers of displacement with regards to water and drought, so that people can build livelihoods and live predictable lives. Second, it is important we've learned that integrating informal settlements like Maziopa into city development plans can work. And we're very happy to indicate that through this project, a lot of stakeholders from JICA, from GIZ, Germans, the city itself, ourselves at UNZA, and many others are exploring of developing a local area plan as a way of integrating this community into the city of Lusaka's investment processes platforms, and the councillor is very much in support. So this is an important insight, and we really want to make good of it. Third, we've learned that the use of locally led inclusive settlement upgrading and informal settlement upgrading processes can be very important. The data from here, giving people from the community to speak about what matters to them and how they want to engage with those matters through the formal processes and through their own locally led processes, is very important. Giving a person a platform to articulate what matters is as important as beginning to think of how to unlock deficits in hard infrastructures. Then lastly, it is important that the ED programs, social protection programs, livelihood supported programs need to be inclusive, need to be transparent, and need to be widely communicated. And crucially, they need to look at different identities that intersect, and that intersection creates vulnerabilities. And that intersection, in our view, is to look at it from the intersectionality lens and address inclusion, transparency, and communication through that lens. And then we can begin to unlock some of the challenges that we face created by rapid urbanization and rapid migration. Thank you so much. Over to you, Marcel.
Thank you so much. And as you were mentioning earlier, I think we can see from both presentations and listening to both teams from Jordan and Zambia, there are obviously, while different contexts, there are convergences emerging. The importance of evidence-based and actionable recommendations and empowerment around water rights, this connection between drought, displacement, and urban inequalities, integrating urban dynamics, climate change factors, and the multi-layered comprehensive neighborhood analysis that we've seen coming out of those two countries, looking at soft and hard infrastructures. So we're now going to open up very, very quickly. We have 2 minutes to 1 or 2 questions. And given that we have prioritized hearing from our panelists, we will put in the chat box a link or an email that you can write to if you have any questions. So I'll very quickly hand over to Maren, who will take 1 or 2 questions for us before we conclude the session. Thanks, Maren.
Thank you, Marcel. So we received a question from Jalal during the presentation on Jordan, and in the interest of time, I'll just read it out. He says, I see that in Jordan, 55 million in Zaatari is serving 80,000 people for 10 years, while 27 million in Al-Dahi, sorry, I can't pronounce it, serves 260,000 people for 30 years. How can we direct investments in a way that gives more lasting benefit to host communities while still not neglecting the refugees? So if I could pass that over to Aya just for a very 30-second answer, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you, Jalal, for the question. Actually, this is a really important question, and this is why we aim to such studies. Evidence-based studies will help direct investments towards the spatial or urban areas, which is gonna both have better impact and a long-lasting benefit on both host community and refugees at the same time, and any future population. Thank you. And I'm also handing over to Dina if she would like to add on this question. Thank you.
Perhaps we can hear from Lucy.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think this is something that IID and partners have been thinking about for many years, and I think it's one of the things we're trying to do is changing the narrative about where people believe refugees belong. So trying to move away from this idea that refugees belong in camps, they should be far away. We should just, literally put a fence around them and give them sort of ongoing temporary infrastructure, and try and change the conversation and show how there's an added benefit to absorbing refugees into urban areas if humanitarian funding is sort of follows where they are. And this is problematic, obviously, given what's happening globally with aid budgets, but actually it seems like quite a good moment to be talking to the refugee agencies and saying, well, your camp responses, we know they're extremely expensive. Now, you've got horrendous budget cuts. Let's think about how we can get a win-win going, how we can support refugees in places where they want to be, and do that through bolstering local systems. Rather than starting, from a completely blank slate and spending 55 million on a new wash network in the desert, how about we think next time about helping refugees to settle in areas that are already better serviced, or where there's a potentially natural expansion of a town or a city into a new area, rather than putting people far away. But this is going to be our last work, really, to try and change the narrative, and to think about how we can provide services to refugees that help everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Aya and Lucy. That's it. We're a minute over, so I'd like to bring the session to a close. We'd like to thank all our attendees, our panelists, and the British Academy for supporting this work. We'll add one more link into the chat and try to address any questions that have come through in our chat box. And thank you so much for joining us today. And we thank also our hosts at World Water Week for a fantastic opportunity to present this work. Thank you so much from all of us. Bye.
Thank you so much. I will end this meeting now.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.